Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk about ReactJS hooks. The title is Yet Another Hooky Talk, and it is mostly oriented on folks who either missed introduction of hooks or maybe new to ReactJS. That was the case for me, actually, when I used React with class components, and then I switched to Angular. But now coming back, I see how hooks are easier for me. But if you are totally new to React, totally new to React, just start with using hooks right away. In this presentation, I'll try to touch on some of the newer and useful hooks. At least some experience with React is recommended for you to understand this. All right, about me. So like Tomasz said already, my name is Kirill Glebov, and I'm software engineer in Outreach, where I work mostly on front-end applications using TypeScript, ReactJS, and Apollo client for GraphQL. So moving on to hooks. Hooks were introduced in React 16.8 on February 2019. And so it's almost 2 years as we have them. They are backwards compatible, and class components are here to stay. If you still have class components in your application, you can keep them, but you could start using functional components and have state in them now. So basically, hooks is a state for function components. So why hooks? One of hooks' main goal was to solve problems of class components. If you use hooks, and you don't have to decide now between function components or class components anymore. Like in past, only class components had state, and now function components have state as well. Now they're not just a pure render function like it was before. Okay, what it gives us, what benefits hooks give us? We don't have anymore to worry about this keyword, and now every component could be function component, which provides easier iterative development without a need to refactor your code that often. So functions are also easier to understand, both for humans and computers. This is actually being said by React creators, which might be subjective, but what I would like to point out is that function components concentrated more on data and its shape, while render is a byproduct. But in class components, we have varied so much about their life cycle. Another advantage of function components with hooks over class components is that stateful logic now could be shared as a custom hook among several components. And now also code is split by logic rather than life cycle. And I think it makes things easier to debug and to understand. Let's discuss some most used and basic hooks, which are useEffect and useState. They both would allow you to create same behavior of component, which was done by lifecycle methods and class components. And these hooks, like any other hook, could also be inside of a custom hook. Moving on to our next slide. So all hooks could be divided roughly by their usage area. So for example, for components logic, you would use useEffect, useLayoutEffect, and useCallback. To work with data, useMemo is useful, and we're going to speak about this later. State is managed by useState, useReducer, and useRef. And then data and logic could be shared between components by using custom hooks and useContext hook. Yeah, I think it's a good summary of this. All right, also hooks have some rules. There are several of them, and we need to follow them when we develop in ReactJS. For this, we have lint plugin to help us. So for it to work, every hook name should start with prefix use. It checks that hooks are called from function components or from custom hooks, right? And these are actually two main rules of hooks. To summarize, don't call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions, because remember, React depends on their order. If you would need to use an if statement or condition, that should be done within a hook. Okay, I think that's it for this slide. Moving on. Now we're going to take a look on hook internals a little bit. And that's also going to explain us why their order is important. So internally, hooks are implemented as nodes. And each node is an object which has memoized state of the component and the link to next node. This is also a reason why every state is unique. So after first hook execution, the pointer moves to the next one, and so on. All right. Okay, now, so use stated would be a first hook which we're going to explore more in details. And I would say this is the most important hook which is used like most often. So it hooks state to function components almost similar to class components. It's being declared by decomposition of an array, which is returned by useState function. And this function also accepts initial value for state to store. It can store any value. But unlike state in class-based components, updating an object or an array in state hook would cause its data would be replaced instead of merging it like it was done in class-based component. Now we can take a look on our first code example. So I hope you can see and it's not too small. Right. So this is quite simple example. I only have a input for name and like a multiplier, for example. So in this hook, my state is stored as an object. And once it's updated, it's get replaced. That's why I have a spread operator here to populate previous values to a new state. And so it's actually quite basic example. I hope you got the idea in here. All right. Now I would like to compare. Sorry. So I would like to compare like a function component with class component. So as you can see on this slide, function component is a bit shorter, and it also doesn't have any boilerplate code like we have in class component. As you can see, there is no constructor anymore. We don't have it at all. We don't have to bind this with a handle click function like we do in class components. But in general, I would recommend you to completely forget lifecycle and class components to understand hooks faster. And we can just test what those. So those are actually quite similar components. Just one of them is a function component, same as you see on a slide, and second one is a class component, like you saw on the slide as well. So we could test it's the same behavior, but this one is shorter. Okay. Moving on to use effect hook. So use effect hook is kind of unique hook in a way that it allows you to trigger side effects. Because remember, like we discussed before, every function component is actually, especially if it was like it was before introduction of hooks, it was just a pure render function. And now you have state there, right? But pure function usually doesn't have any side effects, right? So that's why you need use effect to actually trigger any side effect you would like to do. Also, it allows you to mitigate what was previously done by lifecycle methods in class components, like component did update, component did mount, and component will unmount. But remember, they are not the same. You can try to do something similar, but that's going to be kind of different behavior. And I'm going to explore this in my example. Also, why it's good. So use effect prevents code duplication. And now all logic, like it was spread around those lifecycle methods and class components, is now in one place thanks to use effect. So before we so we discussed this about pure function methods, and what important with use effect hook is that if you wanted to react, let's say, on some variable, you need to pass it as a dependency in here. While if you won't pass this dependency, it only would trigger itself once components get rendered. Okay, so we can take a look how it works. On this page, actually prepared again two components, one of them with a class component and another with a function component. Right now you're looking on, let's go back and I'm open, next slide. So this is comparison of them one by one. And it might seem that it's like actually code-wise is maybe, like not that big of a difference. And by the way, I'm using quite a trivial example of just, doing console log in here, just for sake of simple example, as simple as possible. But it's good enough for me to demonstrate you a sequence of calls. So again, we don't have boilerplate code for constructor. We don't have binding of this, and it's kind of split here again, right? But it's gonna work a little bit differently. So let's open up our console here. Okay, let's refresh the page. So as you can see, you can like hello at first. It was triggered 2 times. One of them was from class component from here, like in component did mount, and second one was from this one with use effect, but without dependency at least. So that's why it's triggered only once. But when I'm updating them, you can see the difference being that component is unmounted only called from my function component, from this function use effect. And this is actually one of the difference between those. And so use effect with dependency would call a cleanup function, which is defined here on every execution, while class-based component would do this only when component would be destroyed. Right, and so remember, what you should remember from this one is that if you want this use effect to react on changes of your variable, just provide it as a dependency like this in here. And we can continue to our next slide, which would be use context. So use context, it's quite simple, but very useful hook. Use context allows you to share data down by component stream. Like before, we had to do something like a pattern, which was called higher order components. And as you can see on slide, you're ending up like with a huge tree of nested components. And if you would like to send some props value downstream, you would have to pass it to every of these child components. But with context, you could do it like look at it like a global variable, which can be shared across all of those components easier. And once this variable from context is changed, it would trigger a render of every component which uses it. I think it would be easier for us to take a look on example to understand this. So in this example, what we have, I have defined 2 sides, dark and light. I have defined 2 contexts here and here, which both of them are initiated with different, like let's say, variables. But once I click this button, we have cookies. The site is going to be changed to dark with this effect. So how it was done is that I actually changed the global variable, context variable for current site, and it triggered the render of this component. We can try again. Boom. Okay, I think that covers it for use context. So on this slide, I listed other hooks for you to explore. Those are built-in hooks, and I'm gonna just quickly glance on them. I don't plan to explore them in details in this talk, just to keep it short and simple. This is more likely for you to explore and to be aware. Use callback would return a memoized callback, and use memo returns memoized value. Both of them will update it if their dependency would change. These hooks actually might be useful to optimize expensive calculation, but you should be careful with them and use them only after you're sure they will increase the performance of your application. And you should compare your performance before and after introducing them. useRef could be used to store variables without triggering a render or storing immutable values. It might also be used to reference HTML elements. Use layout effect runs synchronously immediately after React has performed all mutations, so I might get you some use of it. And use debug value is quite important one if you would develop your own custom hooks. It would allow you to create labels for custom hooks, and you would be able to see them in your React DevTools. Now we're going to talk about custom hooks. So basically, by linter, every function which name starts with use is considered to be a hook. And the main idea of custom hooks is to share stateful logic between components. But it would share only behavior without sharing actual values. And I would say that in your work with React, you would probably use lots of custom hooks. And almost any web API could be a good candidate for custom hook. And then there is a number here to simply impress you. We actually conducted a special research to determine amount of custom hooks we use in Outreach. And the number is kind of astonishing. It is now already 690 hooks. So this information is kind of secret. So that's why you're not able to see that on slides. And now we can take a look on custom hooks example. So in this custom hook, what I try to do is to demonstrate you basically at least some example of fetching data from API, because I was quite often lacking this from talks which I was attending, right? So in this example, I'm sort of mocking a web API by returning a value here. It's not a synchronous request, but at least it's something, right? We're going to look on asynchronous request just in a couple next slides. So in this simple example, I have one state variable and one use effect, which triggers when component is rendered, which tries to fetch this data. And then it displays this, let's say, test account name on the page. What's important here is this is like a custom hook, and like I said before, we can share it among several components. That's it about custom hooks. Now let's talk about use async and use fetch hooks. Those are actually comes from React async library, and we don't use that much of them in Outreach. We actually use a lot of Apollo client hooks, but those are quite similar anyway, and we're going to talk about Apollo hooks as well. So those hooks, their main goal is to provide the declarative way of promise resolution and data fetching. And let's take a look on a code example for this. So in this example, I'm actually fetching real API data from like a public mock API. And what's important here to see for you to understand is that basically in this case, we kind of destructuring return of this hook you use async, and we're getting several variables. It then can affect our rendering, right? It's actually a kind of anti-pattern, and I'm gonna, in the end of my presentation, there will be a link which just discusses this in details, so you know how to do it properly. But in short, what's gonna happen here is we're gonna see our data shown in here, right? Yeah, so it's actually just use fetch method, and there's also a custom hook. I'm thinking what else to mention in here. Yeah, so it would be, when it's loading, it's actually showing like loading. If there are going to be errors, it would show an error. And then it just renders post from this code in here. Right, we're almost close to the end of the presentation. And now we can speak about Apollo client, which is actually used a lot in Outreach. So Apollo client is basically a client to work with GraphQL server. Also, usually it should come probably from Apollo, and it provides two main hooks for React. One of them is use query and use mutation. So in this example, I'm not going to jump to code sandbox. We're just going to stay in the presentation for now. So we have some simple GraphQL query defined here, which gets docs and their ID and breed. And as you can see, the structure of use query is pretty similar to use. I think it's also loading, error, and data. And then you can see what's gonna happen and the GraphQL query itself. So this is widely used in Outreach. If there would be mutation, syntax is pretty similar, but slightly different for mutation, which is also a hook. Okay, and so thank you for listening to my presentation. I shared a short list of useful links, which might be helpful for you to start digging deeper in React hooks. And also, I wanted to point out that in Outreach, we also use hooks for working with browsers, local storage, telemetry, and localization. And I hope that you learned something new today, or maybe you perhaps just refreshed your knowledge a bit. So the amount of hooks is growing. You have your links to explore later. And I hope you would enjoy developing with React hooks. Thank you.